Hello, everyone, and today we're going to read the last of the book, The Case for Miracles by Lee Strobel, Chapter 8 and the conclusion. And today's chapter is entitled, When Miracles Don't Happen. Every day my wife Leslie is in pain. When traditional medical treatments failed, she tried acupuncture, deep massage, diet supplements, and other alternative therapies. While some brought temporary relief, none of them stopped the chronic muscle throbbing that assaults her over and over again. Fibromyalgia affects the way the body processes pain signals. There is no known cure for it. And so, year after year, decade after decade, Leslie copes as best as she can with the discomfort, the soreness, the aching. Let me tell you something else about Leslie. She is a wholly devoted follower of Jesus. She is a woman of spiritual depth whose persistent prayer was, in my view, the most influential factor in bringing me to faith in Christ. She devours the Bible daily. Her compassion for the hurting and spiritually confused is boundless. She is simply the finest and most devout person I have ever known. Have we prayed for relief from her pain? Continually. Have we begged God for her healing? Often and fervently. Have we seen any improvement? Quite the opposite. Could I give you half a dozen theological reasons why there's suffering in this sin-scarred world? Absolutely. I even give lectures on the topic. But this is my Leslie. This is my wife. This is her pain and suffering, and that makes this very personal. While researching this book, I came across inspiring examples of how God miraculously restored sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and life to the dead. I celebrated each tangible expression of God's grace. But after I wrote each story, I asked, why no miracle for Leslie? Yes, I know God promises to cause good to come from our suffering if we're devoted to Him. But why no miracle for Leslie? Yes, I understand that suffering produces perseverance and sharpens our character, but why no miracle for Leslie? Yes, I am aware that there will be no more tears in heaven, but why no miracle for Leslie? Every day my wife is in pain. She needs a miracle. The miracle that didn't happen. Sometimes tragedy reawakens faith. Pain, as C.S. Lewis observed, can be God's megaphone to rouse the spiritually deaf. But what happens when, instead of a miraculous answer to prayer, we hear only silence from above? The miracle that doesn't happen can lead faith to shrink to nothing. That's what happened to Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptic magazine, who we met in Chapter 1. You see, Michael Shermer once lived as a Christian. He met his girlfriend, Maureen, when they were both in college. They were still dating after Michael finished grad school. Maureen worked for an inventory firm, and she and her coworkers would drive in the middle of the night to a company and take inventory while it was closed. One night, in the middle of nowhere, the van veered off the highway and rolled over several times. Maureen didn't have her seatbelt on, and she broke her back. She called Michael at about 5 a.m. He asked, "What's going on?" She said, "I'm in the hospital." Michael was stunned because she sounded normal. What happened?" She said, "I don't know. I can't move." Maureen was paralyzed from the waist down. During an all-nighter in the emergency room, Michael prayed. At that point in his life, he had pretty much checked out of the faith he'd had as a teenager. Still, he got on his knees and bowed his head. "I was as sincere as I had ever been," he told me. "I asked God to overlook my doubts for the sake of Maureen, to heal her, to breathe life into her. As best I could at that moment, I believed, I wanted to believe. If there were a God who was powerful and loving, if there were any justice at all anywhere in the universe, then surely He'd help this precious, caring, compassionate young woman." I waited for Shermer to continue. For a moment there was silence. Then I asked, "What happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing." I let the word hang in the air before finally asking, "How did you react?" He shrugged. "I wasn't very surprised. I thought, well, there probably is no God. Stuff just happens. That's the way the world is." "Was this the final nail in the coffin of your faith?" "Yeah, that pretty much did it. I was like, the heck with it." "Were you angry at God?" "Nothing to be angry at. He's not there. This is just what happens. The good, the bad, it's pretty random. I can understand why Michael felt that way. Maybe you can too. Maybe you've been begging God to meet an urgent need in your life and no miracle is coming. This chapter is for you, and Leslie, and Michael, and me. Becky's story. Sometimes Leslie experiences fibro fog, a mental cloudiness or forgetfulness that comes with her illness. That's what my friend Douglas Gruthius thought was happening with his wife, Becky, who had been diagnosed with fibromyalgia several years earlier. Then one day, she went to the same hair salon where she had been going for years, but she couldn't find her way home. Becky was missing for several hours. Doug finally had to call the police. Clearly, this was more than simple absent-mindedness. Becky was diagnosed with progressive, incurable, and fatal brain disease. Humanly speaking, there is no hope. Death is certain, as the slow loss of her ability to speak, to think, to plan, and to perform the simplest of tasks. As committed Christians, Doug and Becky have earnestly prayed for God's help, and yet, all the while, she continues to gradually lose her mind. Doug and Becky were in their late 20s when they met. She was a writer and editor, and he was a campus minister. She was an elegant writer and a sharp editor, Doug told me. She always improved what I wrote. What did she add? Clarity, the perfect word, the right turn of a phrase. She loved language. She could write magnificent sentences that flowed for 60 words or more. Doug and Becky were married a year after they met. Becky was in her 30s when she was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. It was a fairly new diagnosis back then. Some doctors didn't know what to make of it, Doug said. We tried alternative therapies, but nothing helped very much. I had gone through the same process with Leslie, starting in the days when skeptical doctors thought the illness was more psychological than physical. Over time, Doug told me, she began experiencing forgetfulness and confusion. At that point, we didn't know if it was the early stages of dementia or what. The most troubling event was when she went to the hair salon, which she had visited dozens of times, and couldn't find her way home. I had to file a missing persons report with the police. It was a horrible evening. The forgetfulness kept getting worse. She went to the dentist, and when she got in the car afterwards, she didn't know how to start it. I went and found that the car had been in gear, Doug said. She once asked me, "How do you work the windshield wipers on the car?" At that point, we had owned that car for 10 years. She had increasing difficulty working on the computer. In fact, I bought her a new one that was simpler to use, but she never figured it out. I ended up giving it away. Sliding into dementia. Then, the day after Valentine's Day in 2014, Doug rushed Becky to the emergency room for acute depression. She basically couldn't get out of bed. She couldn't talk, he said. The psychiatrist put her in the behavioral health unit of a hospital across town. They strapped her down and took her away on a stretcher. She looked so forlorn. Becky was hospitalized for 5 weeks. I visited her virtually every day. It was incredibly sad to see her in the psychiatric unit, wandering aimlessly, muddled, and confused. At the end, she wasn't even able to sign the release papers. They diagnosed her with primary progressive aphasia. Primary progressive aphasia is a pretty rare disease. Aphasia is a difficulty finding words, especially nouns. This is especially sad because Becky loved language so much. Just this morning, Doug told me, she came downstairs upset because she couldn't find a hairbrush, and she couldn't think of the word for it. She would gesture and point to her hair. I said, "Hairbrush?" She said, "Yes." The other day, she didn't know what the telephone was or how to work it. Doug continued, "I always marveled at Becky's mind. She was smarter than I am. I remember cleaning out some papers and finding her membership card from Mensa, the Society for Certified Geniuses. I held it and I cried. Her signature at the bottom was in her beautiful handwriting, but today she can't write a word. She doesn't know how to use a pen." "We live in a disposable society where divorce is common," I said. "Yet you have stayed married." Doug smiled. "The decision to stay married and be supportive of my wife was settled when we exchanged our wedding vows, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. Of course, that turned out to be more profound than either of us thought. Hope on hold." Patients with primary progressive aphasia lose their use of words and then their executive functions, the ability to analyze and perform tasks. The particular cruelty of this disease is that Becky is slowly losing her mind, and she's aware of it slipping away. "When Becky despairs, what do you say to her?" I asked Doug. What can I say? I can't tell her it's going to get better in this life. That wouldn't be honest, and we're committed to avoiding cliches and too easy answers, he replied. So I tell her to take it one day at a time, to look for the good things in life, to remember that God loves her. I say, think of the future, of the world without tears, without a curse, when you'll have a perfect resurrected body and you'll be face to face with God. Does that help her? It does. In fact, just this morning I said to her, in the long run, everything will be all right. She asked, what do you mean? I said, the new heaven and the new earth. How did she respond? Big smile. We have hope, but it's deferred, he replied. Recently, Becky and I were having dinner, and I felt moved to offer a toast. A toast? I said. To what? To the source of our hope, he said. To the afterlife. Inscrutable suffering. Having hope doesn't take away all of today's pain, of course. Doug told me I'm becoming an expert on suffering. With a weak smile, he added, I wish God had picked someone else. How do you keep trusting a God who is all good and all powerful and still allows so much suffering? For Doug, the answer is the big picture. Christianity has the best explanation for evil and suffering because of the fall of humanity, he said. Ever since then, the world has been plagued by death, decay, and disappointment. But because Christ experienced the worst of the world and triumphed over it and is now at the right hand of the Father, I know there will be a resurrection, and my wife and I will live in the new heaven and on the new earth. Granted, God has not dealt with suffering and evil completely, but we have the assurance that He will. Then Doug said something I didn't expect. You see, there's a difference between meaningless suffering and inscrutable suffering. The word inscrutable means impossible to understand. I wasn't sure how that could be comforting, so Doug explained. Meaningless suffering means that suffering is simply there. It doesn't achieve a greater good. It has no purpose. Inscrutable suffering means we don't know what the purpose is, but we have reason to believe that God is providential, loving, and all-powerful. Our suffering may seem meaningless to us, but it's not. Here's the point. God uses evil to produce a greater good that could not be achieved otherwise, though we may not understand how. God is unlimited in power and knowledge and wisdom, and we are not. We should expect that certain things will be beyond our understanding. A philosopher once told me that if God can take the very worst thing that could ever happen in the universe, the death of His Son on a cross, and turn it into the very best thing ever to happen in the universe, the opening of heaven for all who follow Him, then He is able to take our difficult circumstances and draw good from them. Before we started talking about Becky, I'd asked Doug for his thoughts on that. There is truth to that, he answered. I often go back to Genesis 50:20, where Joseph says to his brothers who betrayed him, You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. We may not know what good God is achieving in the short run, but given the credibility of Christianity and my 40 years of experience as a Christian, I am justified in believing that there can be significance and purpose in suffering. Yet, I said, often that's small comfort when we're in pain. We can't read the mind of God, came his reply. We don't know why He chooses to work a miracle in some cases and not in others. Yes, it can be agonizing when you've prayed and fasted for the healing of a loved one and God seems to have said no or to wait until eternity. Doug says it helps that he knows that Jesus understands what pain is like. As we were discussing his experience since Becky was diagnosed, he said, When I'm angry at God, when I'm distressed and anguished and seething at my circumstances, I think of Christ hanging on the cross for me. That brings me back to spiritual sanity. He endured the torture of the crucifixion out of His love for me. He didn't have to do that. He chose to. So He doesn't just sympathize with us in our suffering. He empathizes with us. Ultimately, I find comfort in that. The prayer of letting go. Do you still pray for a miracle, I asked? Do you continue to ask God to supernaturally heal Becky? For a long time we prayed and fasted and prayed some more. We sought out people who are gifted in healing. We read all the books on healing and tried to follow their advice. But these days I only pray for a miracle every once in a while. Sometimes I come up behind Becky when she's eating and hug her. I touch her head and ask, God, will you go in there and fix this? Part of her brain is dying, and it's terrible. But no, I don't pray for a miracle much anymore. To be honest, that surprised me. Then what do you pray for? I pray for wisdom in dealing with all the complications of being a caretaker. I pray for her spiritual well-being and for ways to give her some meaning and happiness." "So you've lost hope of a healing?" I asked. "There's a verse in Ecclesiastes that says there's a time to give up. After we got the diagnosis, I didn't give up on God. I didn't give up on Becky, but after a while I essentially gave up on her being healed." "But shouldn't we always be praying for God's miraculous intervention?" I asked. "To give up seems—" I searched for the right word, not wanting to sound harsh. "Well, it seems a little unspiritual." To my relief, Doug wasn't offended. "Not at all," he said. "Remember, I'm not giving up on my faith. I'm not walking away from God. I'm not leaving Becky, and I'm not abandoning hope. But sometimes the most appropriate step when your pleas for healing aren't being answered is to pray a prayer of relinquishment, a prayer of letting go." He explained, "At Gethsemane, Jesus asked the Father to rescue him from the fate of the cross, but his final prayer was one of relinquishment. He surrendered when he could have escaped. He put himself totally in the Father's hands. Whatever his Father had in store for him was what he wanted for himself. And when healing isn't coming, sometimes we have to say, 'Lord, whatever you have in store for me is what I want,' as difficult as that might be at the time. In a sense, it's a prayer of obedience, of submission, of trust, of faith." I asked, "How has praying a prayer of relinquishment changed your attitude toward healing?" He reflected for a minute. "Rather than feeling like I'm always beating God with my fists," he said, "I now feel more like I'm resting in his arms." When the miracle isn't yours. By definition, miracles are outside the normal course of events. They're a supernatural exception to the way the world usually works. Though they're more common than we may think, they're still relatively rare, which means for most people, a sudden and complete healing isn't going to happen. But that doesn't mean God is absent. It doesn't imply that we face our struggles on our own. The other day, I came across a guest blog from someone who speaks with personal authority on miracles that haven't happened. Tricia Lott Wilford's husband died unexpectedly after being sick for less than a day. Suddenly, Tricia was a widowed single mom with 2 children under the age of 5. She knows about personal heartache and unanswered prayers. In the blog post I read, she shared some of her thoughts. "When God gives to other people in a way he hasn't given to you, it's easy to feel left out, and it's hard to want to hear how good he has been to the other people," she writes. "So what do you do when you're in that situation?" In Tricia's experience, saying to God, "Lord, I don't trust you, but I want to," is the beginning of hope when miracles aren't yours. This is the root of confidence even when God doesn't say yes. Ask him to show you where he is, and he says no. He'll show you. He's with you. Sometimes that has to be enough. Conclusion: reaching your verdict. I started this investigation to answer some questions. Does a miracle-performing God actually exist? And if so, is he still in the miracle business today? Is he available to intervene in your life? Or are modern-day miracles nothing more than coincidence, wishful thinking, and fraud? Reaching my verdict. As I looked into whether it's unscientific to believe in miracles, I quickly realized how important biases are. If you define miracles as breaking the unbreakable laws of nature, miracles are impossible. But if miracles are temporary interventions in the way the laws of nature usually work, well, that leaves room for science and miracles. The STEP study that showed that prayer has no effect on healing isn't convincing to me. For one thing, the people doing the prayer were part of a group that doesn't even believe in the possibility of divine intervention. It doesn't tell us anything about authentic Christian prayer and healing. In addition, Cindy Gunther Brown's research shows instant improvements in eyesight and hearing after hands-on prayer by sincere followers of Jesus. Other studies also show that prayer can have a positive impact on healing. More and more researchers are finding the data that support the case for miracles. What's more, I found Craig Keener's study of miracles to be persuasive. I was impressed by so many examples of supernatural intervention in which there were miracles, reliable eyewitnesses, medical documentation, and no reasons for people to lie about it. I found myself agreeing that there might be other possible explanations for some of the miracle accounts, but not all of them, not by a long shot. The extraordinary dreams among Muslims that missionary Tom Doyle told me about clearly go beyond mere coincidence. The dreamers met specific people that they had seen only in their dreams. That's not just happenstance. Something peculiar was going on. Something supernatural, you might say. I found myself ever more convinced that the origin and fine-tuning of the universe, which physicist Michael Strauss described, point perfectly towards the existence of a supernatural creator. And I'm persuaded with the facts of history cited by Detective J. Warner Wallace, established convincingly that Jesus of Nazareth not only claimed to be the unique Son of God, but he then proved it by returning from the dead. In fact, the resurrection goes beyond confirming the existence of God and of miracles. The torture, death, and empty tomb of Christ also answer the question of why God would want to intervene in individual lives through his miraculous touch. Jesus' willingness to endure the crucifixion tells us that God is motivated to take extraordinary action to rescue people. And if he loves people that much, then it's reasonable to believe there would be times when he would choose to use one hand to hold back the forces of nature, while he uses his other hand to miraculously heal someone who is suffering. An open mind. It takes an open mind to consider the evidence of miracles. A lot of people have the attitude, miracles are impossible, period. Now go ahead and try to make your case. I get that. The Bible talks about our human tendency to suppress the truth and walk the other way from God. I've seen that play out in my own life. When I was an atheist, I didn't want Christianity to be true. I was living an immoral, drunken, and selfish lifestyle, and I liked it. When Leslie came to faith in Jesus, her character and values began to change for the better. While that was intriguing, I wanted the old Leslie back. I figured if I could disprove that Jesus returned from the dead, maybe I could debunk Christianity. I knew I would be wasting my time if I approached the investigation with my conclusion already reached in advance. If my journalism training taught me anything, it was to keep an open mind as I pursued answers. At law school, I learned how to evaluate evidence and testimony to determine whether they are solid or shaky. Here's what surprised me. Christianity invites investigation. When the Gospels report supernatural events, they don't begin with once upon a time. Rather, they report specifics that can be checked out. At nearly 2 years of research, I came to my own verdict about miracles. They're often credible and convincing, and they contribute to the larger case for Christ. Compelled by the facts, I joined Leslie in following Jesus, and the word miracle isn't far off in describing the way God has revolutionized my life as a result. As for the time I investigated and studied the evidence for the book you're reading now, it was certainly well spent. In the end, my confidence in a miracle-working God has been deepened and strengthened. As the Court of Appeals would say, the verdict is affirmed. Reaching your verdict. Now it's your turn. What's your verdict? After reading this book, are you convinced that God continues to supernaturally intervene in people's lives? Or are you finding ways to explain away all the evidence that points to a miracle-working God who can act in your life? That's what I once did. I'll never forget the day my newborn daughter was rushed into intensive care. She was clearly terribly ill, but none of the doctors could figure out the problem. Even though I was an atheist at the time, I was so desperate that I actually prayed and begged God, if he existed, to heal her. Soon after that prayer, my daughter was completely back to normal health. The doctors didn't have any explanation. My response was to explain it away with coincidence. I wouldn't even consider the possibility that God had acted. Even if there had been a hospital chart full of evidence of miracles, I wouldn't have believed that God had answered my prayer. I had already made up my mind. You see, the issue wasn't whether I had enough evidence of a miracle-working God. The real issue was, did I want to know God personally? Did I want to get free from guilt, to experience his power for daily living, to connect with him in his life and for eternity in the next? Do you? As you reflect on the contents of this book, I trust that you will keep an open mind and a receptive heart. God offers a free gift of forgiveness and eternal life to all who receive it in repentance and faith. That's what Jesus' death and resurrection were all about. Paying the penalty we deserve for our failures and wrongdoing, and then rising to give us new life with him forever. That's the most valuable miracle of all, and it's yours for the asking. Now that is the end of the book. I hope that you have followed us along in every chapter from the beginning of the book to the end, and I hope that you have kept an open mind throughout this book and that you have considered each of the miracles and the evidence that he has provided. If you believe, I'm glad. If you don't, have you really kept an open mind this whole time? If you haven't, I suggest listening again and really looking at the evidence this time for yourself. It is hard, as this chapter describes, when you have a loved one who is in pain. Any of you who know me know that I have 2 children who suffer from pain, and it will be chronic pain through their life. And it is hard when you pray and you pray, and the pain is still there. But just as the book said, our God is a God who's a loving God who doesn't just sympathize with us, but became man so that he could experience the pain for himself and empathize with us. And having a faith in that kind of God is what keeps us going. God bless you all. And next time I will do one final video on miracles from the community and friends. God bless you all, and have a nice week.